"Elena, we're letting you go, effective immediately." The words landed like a slap-sharp, sudden, and surreal. I was still holding my coffee mug, the one my daughter painted in 3rd grade, when my manager dropped the bomb in front of HR. No explanation, no warning. It was a hollow corporate script from a man who couldn't even look me in the eye. 17 years. That's how long I'd given this company. I'd been there through 3 CEOs, 2 building moves, and a global migration to the cloud. I'd missed holidays, pulled all-nighters, and quietly fixed problems that could have shut everything down. And now I was being erased like a typo in a quarterly report. My body moved before my brain caught up. I walked out of that office, past rows of desks where younger staff looked up confused. Some avoided eye contact. Others whispered. And I realized not one of them knew what I did. That was by design. I wasn't loud, I wasn't flashy, but every system they touched ran because I ensured it didn't break. And just like that, I was gone. But they made one mistake. They thought they were discarding an outdated employee. They didn't know I'd been watching, that I'd seen everything. This story will make you furious and leave you breathless by the end. Before we get into the details, grab a cup of tea, turn up the volume, and don't forget to comment and tell us where in the world you are and what time it is in your local area. We want to know how far these stories go. I remember the first time I walked into that building. It wasn't much back then, just a narrow 3-story office wedged between a laundromat and a shuttered bookstore. I was 32, freshly certified and eager to prove myself. The company had fewer than 50 people. No departments, no hierarchy, just long hours, shared pizzas, and the thrill of building something from scratch. That was the start of what would become my second home. Over the years, I wasn't just another systems engineer. I became the quiet force behind everything digital we did. When a database crashed at 2 a.m., I fixed it. When servers buckled under unexpected traffic, I rerouted before anyone noticed. My name was never on the press releases, but if you looked closely, my fingerprints were everywhere. As the company grew, so did I. I moved from cubicles to a modest corner desk, from basic admin tasks to leading infrastructure overhauls. Promotions came slowly, but I never asked. Recognition was quiet nods in hallway conversations, panicked calls during outages, and the relief in someone's voice when I solved what seemed unsolvable. My husband James used to joke that our router got more of my attention than he did. He wasn't entirely wrong. Our daughter Lily grew up hearing the sound of my typing late into the night. She once told me she thought my job was internet doctor because I always made broken stuff feel better. But something started to change last year. A new executive team came in with fresh buzzwords, efficiency, modernization, and streamlining. They replaced thoughtful processes with pretty charts and experience with enthusiasm. I tried to keep up. I offered insights and flagged risks, but my voice was slowly drowned out in meetings filled with nodding heads and marketing lingo. And then there was Zoe, young, bright, and newly hired from a consulting firm. I liked her immediately. She reminded me of myself at that age. We bonded over bad coffee and the quiet exhaustion of being the only 2 women in the IT wing. One day, she immediately forwarded me an internal message, a string of emails about position realignment, signed off 2 weeks before my termination. My name was on that list. It was the same name that wasn't mentioned once during my actual dismissal. That's when the first crack appeared. My exit wasn't just about budgets or downsizing. There was something deliberate in how it was done. Something premeditated. They hadn't simply moved on, they'd erased me. And I couldn't help but wonder, what were they trying so hard to hide? After Zoe's accidental email, I started replaying the last few months in my mind, the strange gaps in communication, the team meetings I wasn't invited to, and the project assignments that somehow bypassed me entirely. At the time, I brushed it off, chalked it up to growing pains, or the new management adjusting workflows. But now, it felt different, too intentional. I remember logging into the admin portal one morning and noticing that my access privileges had changed. Nothing dramatic, just a few permissions quietly missing. The kind of access only someone with deep system knowledge would even realize had been revoked. I didn't raise a flag, I just watched. because sometimes silence speaks louder than confrontation. It wasn't just the access. It was the way emails suddenly stopped CCing me, the way Daniel, our new VP of operations, avoided eye contact in the break room, and the way the thank you for late-night saves became replaced by tight nods and closed-door meetings. I kept a record of everything, not because I suspected foul play, at least not yet, but because old habits die hard. I'd always documented thoroughly a discipline I learned during a compliance audit years ago. You never know when you'll need to trace a breadcrumb back to its source. James noticed it before I did. One evening, we were sitting on the porch, our little ritual when the day got too loud. He looked at me and said, "You've been quiet lately." Is it the job? I shrugged and told him it was nothing. But the truth was, something about work had shifted. Not in a way you could point at. It's more like how the air feels heavier before a storm. A few days later, I found something I wasn't supposed to see. I was doing a routine system health check, something no one else is bothered with anymore, when I noticed a batch of automated payments flagged as vendor miscellaneous. At first glance, it looked routine, but one vendor's name stood out. I didn't recognize it, and I knew every approved vendor we'd used in the past decade. Bluebridge Media. I clicked deeper, tracking the payment trail small. At first, there were small invoices, then they grew quietly and steadily. There were no memos and there were no matching project tags. It was just money moving through channels that shouldn't have existed. I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. I copied the records to a private encrypted drive and returned to work like nothing had happened. Because if there's one thing I'd learned in 17 years, it's this: the real danger isn't the glitch you can see. It's the one hiding in plain sight. The name kept circling in my head: Bluebridge Media. I'd never approved that vendor. I never heard a single team mention it. And in a place where every dollar needed at least 3 signatures that didn't sit right. That night, after Lily went to bed and James fell asleep on the couch, I opened my laptop and started digging. The business address listed for Bluebridge led to a UPS store downtown. The company website was a single splash page with no contact information, staff bios, or even a basic services list. It had just a stock image of a bridge at sunset and a tagline that meant nothing: connecting tomorrow. I checked the state's business registration portal. Bluebridge Media LLC was formed just 8 months ago. The listed owner was Travis Hall. That name didn't show up in our vendor contacts HR directory or procurement logs, but when I cross-referenced with public records, it got more interesting. Travis Hall was the brother-in-law of Mitchell Crane, our CFO. It felt like swallowing a mouthful of ice. My stomach didn't flip. It just settled. Heavy. Quiet. Because now it was clear this wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. It wasn't even favoritism. This was a scheme, one designed carefully enough to be hidden in plain sight under the radar of audits and surface-level checks. Small enough to avoid triggering alarms, but consistently sufficient to pull real money from real budgets. Every invoice had been signed off without oversight, and every transaction layered between line items was too dull for anyone to question except me, because I was the one who still ran monthly system integrity checks and remembered vendors who didn't exist. I printed everything: invoice records, ownership documents, payment authorizations, and didn't just store them on a drive. I burned copies to disks and stored backups off-site. I'd seen too many systems accidentally wiped to trust anything digital. At work, I acted the same. Polite nods, calm replies. I even thanked Mitchell during a finance IT check-in to see if his eyes would twitch. They didn't. But now I had something they didn't know I had. And I knew they thought I was too old, tired, or loyal to notice. They wanted me gone before this came to light. But the truth has a habit of finding cracks to crawl through. And I was about to become the one thing they hadn't accounted for: persistent. I didn't storm into anyone's office. I didn't send angry emails. What I had wasn't rage, it was clarity. The kind that settles in when you know too much to act recklessly. So I did what I've always done best. I made a plan. It started with a list, not of names, but of patterns, payment amounts, dates, access requests, and system logs. I layered the evidence piece by piece the way you'd build a firewall. Quiet, secure, undeniable. There was no single smoking gun, but when you stood back, the pattern screamed. But evidence alone wouldn't be enough. If I blasted it out immediately, it could be dismissed as a disgruntled ex-employee lashing out. I needed timing. I needed leverage. I needed the truth to speak for itself in a room where it couldn't be ignored. That's when I thought of Linda Evans. She'd been on the board for years, sharp respected, and one of the few executives who remembered my name without glancing at a badge. Years ago, we'd worked together on a compliance overhaul. She trusted me then. Maybe she still would. I found her contact tucked away in an old email thread from 2017. I wrote her a short message, not everything, just enough to raise a question she couldn't ignore. I didn't ask for a favor. I asked for 15 minutes, and I asked her to take a quiet look at a file I'd attached, a sanitized version of the Blue Bridge timeline, names withheld, but details intact. While I waited for her reply, I set the next piece in motion. I reopened an internal tool I'd built years ago for security testing an email, alias that looked like it came from the company's finance systems. It wasn't on any employee registry. I'd used it to test phishing resilience when people still cared about audits. Now it would help me trigger the panic that would force attention. I drafted the message with care, just enough to make someone sweat, but not enough to tip all my cards. Then I set it to send during the next board meeting, Wednesday morning, 9:00 a.m. sharp. James watched me from across the kitchen that night, his eyes asking what he didn't say aloud. I met his gaze, steady and calm. They thought removing me was the end of the problem. What they didn't know was I hadn't even started. The night before the board meeting, I couldn't sleep. Not from nerves, but because my gut told me I was only seeing part of the picture. If Blue Bridge was a front, who else had their hands in the scheme? I opened my laptop one more time and went deeper. What I found unraveled quickly. Blue Bridge wasn't the only shell vendor. There were others, ClearPoint Strategies and North Base Media, with different names but the same patterns. They were tiny startup firms with no presence and a handful of website templates, each tied to someone within our executive circle. ClearPoint was registered as a cousin of our head of procurement, North Base. It is owned by the former roommate of our independent tech consultant, Mark Leland, who had been brought in during the restructuring. None of it was a coincidence. I traced every payment, mapped every access log. The spreadsheet grew thicker, the lines clearer. Every consultant and shell vendor had slipped in just after a key IT veteran had been quietly pushed out. I wasn't the first, I was just the last. And then it hit me. The reason I'd been around for so long wasn't loyalty or necessity, it was timing. They needed me to keep things running until their replacement systems were in place. Once those were live, once the fraud channels were secure, I became expendable. Worse, I became dangerous. Because I still had access, I still had history, and I still remembered what the system looked like before they started feeding it garbage. And now I had proof that the CFO wasn't acting alone. This was a coordinated operation, built slowly, layer by layer, like malware disguised as a routine update. They didn't expect me to see it, let alone piece it together. Most people wouldn't. But I wasn't like most people. Zoe messaged me later that night. Just 3 words. Something feels off. I almost laughed. She was right, and the funny thing was none of them realized the person they erased was the only one capable of exposing them all. I stared at my final report, hands steady. I didn't feel heroic. I felt responsible. Like a janitor finding mold behind the walls, quietly horrified, but strangely relieved that now finally someone would deal with it. Tomorrow the cracks would start to show. And this time, they wouldn't be able to patch them over. Not with numbers, not with buzzwords, not with silence. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of chill that sinks into your skin, no matter how many layers you wear. I sat in my car across the street from headquarters, watching as the executives filtered through the revolving doors in suits too crisp for people with nothing to hide. My laptop sat open on the passenger seat, the email I'd scheduled ready to launch at exactly 9:00 a.m. It wasn't just one email. I'd prepared several, each tailored and sent from a different internal alias I'd created during my years in cybersecurity testing. They looked authentic, indistinguishable from official system alerts or finance queries. The main one, flagged urgent financial audit inconsistency, was designed to land in the inboxes of every board member, including Linda. The attachment was a tidy PDF. There were no accusations, just questions, graphs, vendor comparisons, and a quiet outline of $1 million question. Where exactly is this money going? At 9:02, I saw the first reaction through the window, a junior assistant sprinting toward the boardroom with a folder in hand. By 9:07, my phone buzzed an unknown number, then another. I let them all go to voicemail. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted exposure. At 9:22, an email from Mitchell Crane popped into my inbox. The subject line read, "Let's talk. Now." I didn't open it. 10 minutes later, Vanessa from HR followed with a more official tone. "Please refrain from contacting company personnel. Legal consequences may apply." They were scrambling, and they still didn't understand I hadn't broken anything. I'd only highlighted what was already cracked. At noon, I drove to my bank. In my safety deposit box was an older backup archived email threads, original access logs, and handwritten notes from long-forgotten meetings where people had said more than they should. I tucked the materials into a new envelope, labeled it with Linda's name, and slipped it into my bag. That night, Zoe texted, "Something's happening. People are freaking out." "What did you do?" I replied with just one sentence. "Don't get involved. Just watch." Because the setup was complete, the dominoes were aligned, and by the time the right question was asked in the boardroom, they wouldn't just be wondering who sent the email. They'd be wondering how they didn't see it coming. By Thursday morning, the silence had turned into noise. Headlines trickled through local business feeds. Internal audit underway, at tech giant Anonymous. Tip Sparks, executive shakeup. No names were mentioned yet, but anyone who worked inside those walls knew what was coming. Zoe texted again, this time longer. "They're pulling access. Mitchell's office is locked. Security is everywhere. Did you start this?" I didn't reply right away. I was sitting in a diner 2 towns over, sipping coffee and listening to the hum of breakfast chatter. The folder with Linda's name lay on the table untouched. I'd already sent her the files digitally, but something about handing her a hard copy felt respectful, tangible. Like I was saying, "Here's the truth. Hold it in your hands." By 10:00 a.m., Linda called. "Elena," she said, calm and sharp. "The board has seen everything. They're furious, and they want you to come in." I didn't flinch. "I'm not interested in reclaiming a desk. That's not what this is," she said. "They're creating something new, a position with real oversight. I am not reporting to Mitchell or HR, direct to the board." She paused, then added, "We've already suspended 3 people. Mitchell's not fighting it. He knows it's over. But we need you." Need. That word sat heavy in the air. Later that afternoon, Vanessa emailed again. This time her tone had softened. Attached was a severance agreement with new terms, a revised NDA, and a much larger check. I didn't even open the document. Money wasn't the point. It never had been. At sunset, James and I walked through the neighborhood. I told him everything. Every step, every doubt. He listened without interrupting, then said, "So what now?" It was a good question. Justice had been served, but quietly, internally, the way corporate worlds prefer. No arrests, not yet. But investigations were active and people were stepping down. The funny thing was, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt responsible, like a systems admin who'd finally patched a breach that had been leaking for too long. That night, Linda called again. "We need someone who understands integrity, not just systems. And you're the only one they'll trust now." It wasn't a reward. It was a reckoning. This time I would decide what stayed and what was deleted for good. The next morning I found myself standing in front of the same building where I'd once been quietly dismissed. The glass doors and reception desk were the same, but this time the security guard greeted me by name. His smile was sheepish, almost apologetic, as he handed me a visitor badge. "Welcome back, Ms. Moore." The elevator ride to the top floor felt strange, like walking through a version of my old life that had been rewired. The boardroom was quieter than I expected. No one rushed to speak when I entered. Linda nodded toward the seat at the end of the table. "Elena, thank you for coming," said the interim CEO, her voice steady but uncertain. "We've reviewed everything. The scale of what you uncovered. It's more extensive than we imagined." I didn't respond. I just listened. She continued. "The board has unanimously approved a new position, Chief Integrity Officer. You'll report directly to us. You'll have the authority to audit, oversee compliance, and veto decisions threatening system transparency. It's yours if you want it." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I opened the folder I brought, which contained a list of conditions: full access, independent staffing, legal autonomy for whistleblowers, and a budget that wouldn't be cut quietly under vague terms like restructuring. She flipped through the pages, pausing at each line. When she looked up, her expression had changed. "These are bold." "So was the fraud," I replied. Silence hung in the room. Not tension, just realization. "You have until Monday," I said, standing. "I have other options." Back home, James was already in the kitchen fixing coffee. When I told him what they'd offered, he leaned back, arms crossed. "Do you want to go back?" That question sat with me for hours. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a test of what I stood for, whether I believed a place that once erased me could become something worth returning to. Not out of nostalgia, but because someone had to ensure the cracks didn't open again. By nightfall, I knew my answer, but I kept it to myself for now. Some bridges collapse. Others you rebuild stronger than before. But only if you're the one laying every brick. 6 months later, my new office overlooked the skyline I'd once watched disappear in my rearview mirror. But everything felt different now, not just the view or the title on the door. It was how people walked past my office, slower, more deliberate, like they knew something had shifted. The role of Chief Integrity Officer wasn't ceremonial. I made sure of that. Every month, I met directly with the board. I rebuilt the whistleblower protections from scratch. I approved audits without prior notice. I trained my new team to look beyond numbers, to read between the spreadsheets, to listen for silence where noise should have been. Zoe was the first person I promoted. She had the instincts, and more importantly, she had the nerve to ask questions even when no one was watching. One afternoon, she came by my office with a nervous smile. "I still can't believe you're back," she said. I smiled, not because I couldn't believe it, but because I finally could. Mitchell had resigned quietly after the investigation. Several others followed, some with shame, others with silence. There were no headlines, but plenty of accountability. We handed the case files to federal investigators. That part was no longer my fight. James asked me once during dinner if I was happy. I had to think about it. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't tired. I wasn't even waiting for the subsequent betrayal. I felt solid, grounded, like a pillar instead of a shadow. After our quarterly review, I lingered in the hallway outside the old IT wing that Friday. A younger employee passed me, nodded respectfully, and then glanced back like they were trying to place me. I didn't stop them. I didn't need to be recognized. Truth doesn't need applause. It just needs to be protected. Back at my desk, I logged onto my LinkedIn for the first time in almost a year and typed a simple sentence. Sometimes you don't burn bridges, you build a better one beside it. And then, as the sun dipped below the Denver skyline, I shut the laptop, grabbed my coat, and headed out. Before you go, don't forget to tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. We love knowing how far these stories travel. If this one made you feel something, subscribe. We've got more to tell.